Hey everybody, we're talking about behavior today. Everybody knows what it is, but can you actually explain what it is? People know how people behave. In fact, when we grow up, our parents often tell us, you need to behave. We go to school, the teacher tells us the same thing. Your behavior is unacceptable. We need you to behave in a certain manner. You need to follow the rules, the guidelines. The chart shows us how we should behave. But what is behavior? Interesting concept, especially in the workplace. We expect people to behave in a manner that is consistent with where you work. So for instance, if you work at a sales place, you're probably going to be much more optimistic, much more energetic, much more outgoing. That's how they want you to behave in order to attract new customers in. Accountants, on the other hand, probably are not going to be as outgoing, as gregarious. They're going to be a bit more muted, more what we would call studied. When you look at certain professions, we can in some ways predict how well they're going to behave. Doctors, for instance, we wouldn't want a doctor that's quite excitable, because what if they're excitable about something that is not good? And so they tend to be much more studied, again, just like accountants. So professions and the people that are in the professions often behave in a certain way. Coaches, for instance, of a football team, probably not as muted, probably not as laconic as you would want. You'd want somebody who would be what we would call motivational, somebody who can inspire the people who work for them to achieve their greatest ambitions, to at least to achieve their potential. So behavior is a concept that is good to learn whether we're going to be a teacher, an operations manager, or a leader, somebody who understands what causes behavior and how you can influence behavior, especially for organizations that are looking to create a better organization. If they can figure out a way that they can modify, transform, direct their employees' behavior, it could result in possibly achieving objectives in a more expedited manner or achieving them at all. So that's what we're going to look at. What is this thing we call behavior, and how can we modify behavior so that we can best direct our employees and others to act in a certain way? Act. It's a key word associated with behavior. So when we talk about thinking is not something that necessarily bothers us. We are not necessarily what we think, because there's some people who dream and think, but it never seems reality. In other words, they never implement what they think. For instance, there's some people that'll say, I hate that person in their mind. But do they really hate the person when they talk to them? Probably not. But that's how our mind and our thought process may work. What we think is not often what comes out of our mouth. In fact, we hope to have some type of trigger or mechanism that prevents from what we really think from actually coming out. So thinking and behavior are quite different. Behavior is, which is the first section that we'll talk about here, it's about the way people act, hence the word act. So we can see somebody's behavior. You can see how a person behaves. And it typically isn't raised to the person's consciousness until they behave in a way that is not consistent with the expectations. Parents is a good example. Parents will have little kids and they will tell their children, I expect you to behave in a certain manner. When you go over grandparents, grandma or grandpa, make sure you don't touch anything, and make sure you say please and thank you. Those are all behavior mechanisms. In order to see somebody's behavior, it has to be evident. We can't predict somebody's behavior unless we necessarily see it. For instance, every time you go over grandma's, you break something, so make sure you keep your hands on the side. We know how they're going to behave. But again, behavior is something that is seen. It is an action. A thought is much different. We often can't determine how people think. That being said, it may be beneficial to talk about organizations. So as we move from the personal to the organizations have what we call visible aspects. They have structures, technologies, formal authorities, chain of command. All those are intended to ensure that people conform to certain behaviors. So we create mechanisms so people act in a certain way. act is very similar, of course, to behavior. Again, going back to going to grandma's, we may, with our children, say you can't go into certain rooms. That is a structure, even something, a kind of a formal authority, saying this is how you're going to act, and we're going to have these restraints. So often with behavior, we have restraints that are intended to guide somebody's behavior in a certain way. Organizations do that by the way that organizations are created. There's also these invisible aspects that we often can't see, hence the word invisible, which relate to motivations and attitudes, ambitions, and perceptions. We're going to talk about some of those as the presentation continues, but our goal in relation to behavior, organizations or personal, is to explain, predict, and influence behavior. The more that we can influence behavior, especially for those we work for, the more we can direct it in a manner which we believe, as managers and leaders, should be directed. We want to harness the potential of each employee and direct that potential in a certain manner and in a certain direction. And by doing so, we should be more apt, we should more readily achieve the future that we have determined is where we should be. So how do we explain, predict, and influence behavior? Not an easy thing, right? But we try to explain the behavior that we want in question. We expect when you talk to a customer that you will say blank, that your mechanisms, your mannerisms, as presented to a customer would be indicative of this type of behavior. For instance, we expect you to smile. We expect you to extend your hand and shake the hand of whoever you're meeting. So those are actual mechanisms that we would relay to somebody that says this is exactly how you're going to behave. Another one that we don't talk much about is that you'll listen before you talk. So when you go to talk to a customer, it's important that you find out what the customer wants and needs before you start talking about what you believe the customer should need. So we explain the behavior that we want. Second, is we try to predict the future behaviors. If this continues, this is going to be the impact of what happens. So if you continue to denigrate other people, if you continue to be disrespectful to your coworkers, then you have to talk about the impact. And then you have influence. Influence is where we all try to influence a person's behavior. There's really 4 factors that help us predict and explain behavior. In fact, there's 4 factors that we have to be aware of if we want to understand this concept of behavior and then modify that behavior in a direction that we think is advantageous for us and the individual and the organization if we're talking about organizational behavior. What are those 4? The 4 are attitudes, personality, perception, and learning. So, as we try to predict behavior, and once we know what causes behavior, then we can address each of these aspects so that if attitude is affecting somebody's behavior, then we'll work on mechanisms to change their attitude. If it's personality that's impacting a person's behavior, then we as managers, even as parents, but more as managers and leaders, because we're talking about organizations and behavior, the more that we can understand a person's behavior, we can modify, redirect that behavior so that it alters their behavior. And then there's perception and learning. Each of these are going to be discussed in greater detail. But there's so many, as we talk about attitude, there's so many examples that we can give about a good or a bad attitude. Politicians, for one, we tend to look for politicians that have a really good attitude. Attitude is the way that we view things. It's the way that we interpret what happens in our world. And there's a great story I often talk about this individual who was driving into a new town. And they went to a gas station and they said, "Hey, we're new to this town. What's this town like?" And the gas station attendant said, "Well, what did you see when you came in?" He goes, "Well, I saw people who didn't take care of their lawns. I saw homes that weren't painted. I waved to a person and they didn't wave back. I was driving down the street and somebody cut me off as I was trying to make a turn. It didn't seem very hospitable. And the person said, you often experience what you see. What you see is often what you get. The way that you determine something is often the way that the reality is going to work. Their attitude, which was not a very good place to be, was a result of how they saw that that city. A couple minutes later, another person drives up and says, hey, we're new to this town. What's this town like? They said, well, what did you see? What did you see so far? And they said, oh, people were so nice. We stopped and talked to a couple people. They went out of their way to make us feel welcome. The roads were clean. It looked like people made every effort to have a very presentable yard. And the person says, you're always going to get what you see. Attitude. Attitude is often how you interpret the factors that present themselves in your life. There's not a person that I have met that hasn't had challenges in their life. Name any famous, infamous person, and there is a challenge or more somewhere, someplace in that person's history. We may not know what that challenge is. It could be physical, mental. It could be familiar, in other words, with their family, or it could be with their friends. And that background, that barrier challenge, has caused considerable strife in that person's life. But their success, their happiness, their peace is all dependent on how they deal with that barrier that they may have. I've said for so long, everybody has something, and you become a somebody by doing something with that something. In other words, we all have something in our lives. Our success is determined by how we deal with that aspect that we had in our life that we wish we didn't have. So attitude is determined by three areas: our cognitive, affective, and behavioral aspects. Attitude is created by the beliefs that we have, often from our youth, our young ages. It's also a component of attitude is determined by our emotions and our feelings. I feel this. Emotions and feelings can be so destructive to a person, especially if those manifest themselves to others. Emotions we don't know about until we can see them. Feelings we often don't know about until we hear them. We hope that we control our emotions and control our feelings so they don't become a determining factor in who we are and where we want to go. And then behavioral is this intention to behave in a certain way, where we try to constrict how we behave. Attitude is so fundamental to a person's behavior. We must control the negative aspects of our attitude, and then we must expand upon the positive aspects. Anybody that receives an email from me, at the bottom, it always says, always look for the good along the road of life. I've always felt that there's so much more in life to be grateful for than ungrateful. There's a saying that says, be grateful for what you have in life, not ungrateful for what you don't have in life. Again, be grateful for what you have in life, not ungrateful for what you don't have in life. And so I tend to be grateful for everything that I have. That manifests itself, we hope, in my attitude. That attitude, which is a positive expression of who I am, where I want to go, where I want to be, I think that presents itself well to other people. And for an organization or for a customer who is dealing with somebody with a positive attitude, that can only be beneficial to anybody who's associated with that type of attitude. And that leads us to the personality. The personality is those traits and characteristics that make you who you are. We understand that about a third of a person's personality is inherited. What does that mean? That means that you largely can control your personality. For those people who say, well, that's just the way they are, that's not necessarily true. They may be inclined to be that way, but that doesn't mean that that's the controlling aspect. One of the great examples, it's not an exact example, but one of the ones I like to give is there's certain people that are always late. And you'll hear something like, oh, they're always late. Are they? They're usually not late to work. They probably aren't late to their wedding. So are they really always late? You also hear people who say they have a very bad temper. They can't control their temper. I always kind of say, can they? Because they don't have that temper with a customer. They don't have that temper with a supervisor. If they did, they'd be fired. Why can they control it in some areas but not others? So, although there may be personality traits that you wish you didn't have, they are not the controlling mechanism to determine your overall personality. It is the combinations of our emotions and our thoughts and our behavior patterns, but just like attitudes, it does affect how we behave. But we largely, as mentioned, can control our personality. Therefore, that aspect, personality, should not be a controlling factor on how we behave. Like attitude, personality is also a choice. Hopefully, as we move through this presentation, we see that so much of our behavior is a choice. We largely can determine how we behave in nearly any circumstance. It's a matter of control. Control is something that arises when we talk about perception. Perception is the way we view things. People may see the same event, but have different interpretations. Example, somebody may stand in line to get some food, and it may take 3, 4, 5 minutes, and they can be quite upset about the time that they've spent in line for food. In fact, they may even think that, wow, this only happens when I get in line. Everybody else sails through, but when I get in line, it seems like there's a line. Somebody else may be in the exact same line, turn to somebody, have a very pleasant conversation, and they may perceive that circumstance as highly positive. Wow, I just had the greatest lunch. I was standing in line and had a great conversation with somebody. I really learned quite a bit about who they are and where they're going. Two situations exactly the same, perceived differently. Another example is a person driving to work. And as they drive to work, they're maybe just a few minutes away from work, but quite close to being late. And there's a train. And they have to stop for a train. And it's not just a short train. It's quite a long train. And one person may say, that's my luck today. It is indicative of having a terrible day. It's only going to get worse from here. Another person may say, wow, that is a beautiful train. They may even read, yes, some of the graffiti on the train and say, wow, that's kind of interesting. Look at the artwork there. They can have the exact same situation, both possibly late to work, but they view the situation quite differently. Perception. It's an amazing circumstance, perception. As you know, we've talked about attitude already. Also, we've talked about this aspect of personality, and now perception. These are all circumstances that we face, certainly on a daily basis, and we may not have thought that we actually have control over how we perceive things, how our personality affects our behavior. But the more we talk about it, just in this short presentation, we realize that we really are the master of our future in terms of our attitudes, personalities, and perceptions. And the same goes with learning. Because in order to have a permanent change in our behavior, we have to have the experience that allow that. Where do those experiences come from? We constantly learn from these experiences. Obviously, one is in education. The second is the scenarios and circumstances that we present ourselves in. In other words, reading. Reading can change our behavior because our perspectives change. Meeting new people. We call them sages, very smart individuals. And we can meet people who change our perspectives through this learning, our perspectives or attitudes, even our personality changes based on the people that we meet. Travel is another great example where we can change our attitudes, personalities, and our perceptions. There are many different learning theories related to how best can we change behavior. There's the operant conditioning and the social learning. Both are as important. The operant conditioning is where you learn to behave to get something that you want and to avoid something that you don't want. You get conditioned on how to do it. If I ask in this way and say please and thank you, I might get what I'm looking for. If I don't, I probably am not going to get that. There's people who say, when they ask for volunteers, put your head down, operant conditioning, which says if you put your head down and avoid eye contact, they may not pick you. Social learning is where you observe what happens to others, and by being told about something by someone who has direct experience. That comes from these sages. We're talking to people, meeting new people, and find out, well, what did you do to obtain that position? What did you do to obtain your wealth? How did you avoid blank when raising children? So we can learn. So much of our life is about learning, but it's not necessarily just learning, it's applying. It is understanding what you've learned and then adapting and assessing what you learned to change your very future. Which leads us to the key points of this presentation, which is we have a much more diverse workforce, and that necessitates understanding how people think and behave. When we think of diverse, we automatically think sometimes of just race or even gender. It's so much more than that. It's people that have different backgrounds because they may have come from one country or another, one town or another, which can be completely different in the same state and in the same country. So people have so many differences in their lives that, in fact, having any type of commonality is even more difficult. But when you have a diverse workplace and workforce, you have to make sure that you really understand how people think and behave. That's really so critical to what we're talking about today. Secondly, is only understanding why people behave the way they did can they develop a strategy to affect their behavior. And so what I did for years, negotiations, labor negotiations on behalf of a municipality. And it wasn't just we want this and we want that, you want this and I want that. It is trying to figure out why is that issue so important to them. In fact, it might be a minor issue to us, but to them, it's fundamental to just about everything that they know and just about everything that they believe. So we have to figure out why that issue is so important. Why is that such a stumbling block for you? Because on our perspective, it's minor. But if you understand the whys, it often tells you what to do. Third, hopefully, one of the key points that you've learned in this short presentation is people can be taught and learn new ways to think and act. They absolutely can. Anybody, there's a saying that says you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Who knows why these sayings come up, but that's absolutely not true in relation to behavior. There's another saying, a Chinese saying that says a 70-year-old man can learn from a 71-year-old man, which means that you can always learn from someone. They don't have to be older, by the way, but you can always learn from somebody if you so choose to learn. Because people largely have control over their thoughts, beliefs, actions, and behaviors. They just do. And we have to learn the process to control your behavior. One final thought. Some people have said, oh, we can control our behavior. Well, it's nice to hear. Oh, so it's largely within our control. Okay, I get that. But how? How can I control my behavior? The last slide are 4 thoughts that I've had over the years about how somebody can best control their behavior. They may be trite, even simplistic, but I think it's a great start on how we can learn to control our behavior. One is to be optimistic. If you remember the first 3 aspects of our presentations, which were attitudes and personalities, perceptions, those are all impacted by the way we think. And if we think in an optimistic way, we'll behave in an optimistic way. Second is to be inspirational, a contributor. Be somebody who uses that positivity, the optimism that we had in the first slide, or the first bullet, and goes around in their environment, whether it's the workplace or the home place, with a positive attitude. Oh, don't worry that you fall. Get back up. Oh, don't worry that you lost that. Hopefully you find this. Oh, don't worry that you can't eat that on the menu. They've added this other aspect that may be just as good. It's this reflection. And in some ways, even a deflection and reflection, so that a person spends less time on what they wanted and didn't get, and instead are more appreciative of what they got that they didn't think they could get. Third is to be grateful, and fourth is to be gracious. Grateful and gracious are two of the words that I use quite a bit. Grateful means that you're appreciative for whatever good fortune that comes into your life. And I've yet to meet a person that doesn't have something in their life that I wish I had. Everybody has something, as we mentioned. Everyone has something, and what you do with that something can make you a somebody. So think less of what other people have and be ungrateful that you don't have it. And think more about what you have and to be so darn grateful that you have it. And to be gracious is a sense of kindness that some may say isn't evident enough in society today. It could be. You could be the start. I could be the start of the continuation. But being gracious is being a very kind and generous person to anyone that we meet. Generous doesn't have to be, I'm going to buy you lunch. Generous could be a compliment, especially if somebody's having a bad day or not a good week. To be grateful and gracious, if you have those attributes and traits, then they're going to be displayed in the way that you behave in any environment that you become a part of, and you will be a force for good and goodness in your world. Thanks, everybody. Certainly enjoy the day.